A ghostly silence hangs over the Gulf of Patras. The setting sun stains the water, already tinged with the blood of tens of thousands of men, a deep, dark shade of rust. The camera glides slowly over a vast, floating cemetery. Splintered masts rise toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The wreckage of shattered galleys covers the surface, and thousands of bodies float inertly among the debris. The Christian victory is total, overwhelming, almost biblical in its scale. The most powerful navy in the EAE world has been annihilated. Then, over this scene of absolute triumph and desolation, a voiceover poses a disturbing question. Was this the greatest victory in history, or the most useless triumph ever achieved? The myth of the Battle of Lepanto is simple, powerful, and has been taught for centuries. It was the battle that saved Europe, the heroic naval crusade that forever broke Ottoman sea power in the Mediterranean and halted the tide of Islam. But the reality, as is often the case, is far more complex, ironic, and ultimately depressing. Lepanto was, without a doubt, a tactical triumph of legendary proportions, a spectacular victory of technology, brutality, and courage. Yet, it was simultaneously a strategic catastrophe, a failure of political vision so profound that it almost completely nullified the glorious carnage. This is the story of how the Holy League won the greatest battle of its time and yet lost the war. It is the tale of how a victorious alliance forged in the fire of fear, disintegrated amidst its own glory, consumed by the very rivalries and greed that had created it. It is the chronicle that proves the terrible and prophetic truth uttered by the Ottoman Grand Vizier to the victors. In destroying our fleet, you have only shaved our beard. It will grow back. But in taking Cyprus, we have cut off one of your arms. It will never grow back. At the head of the Christian Armada, there was not a single hero, but a man trapped in a diplomatic nightmare. Don John of Austria, the young and illegitimate half-brother of King Philip II of Spain, was less a commander and more a lion tamer. His main challenge was not just facing the Ottoman fleet, but preventing his own captains, Venetians and Spaniards, mortal rivals who hated each other with an almost theological passion, from killing one another before the enemy had the chance. His alliance, the self-proclaimed Holy League, was a fragile and monstrous creature, united not by faith, but by fear of Ottoman expansion and greed for the spoils of war. The League's fleet was a naval mosaic, a patchwork quilt of approximately 208 galleys and 6 innovative galleasses. They were ships and men from Venice, Spain, the Papal States, Genoa, and the Knights of Malta, nations that were as much competitors as they were allies. The official motivation was revenge for the brutal Ottoman conquest of Cyprus and the need to halt the seemingly unstoppable Turkish tide. But beneath the surface of religious propaganda, the motives were purely terrestrial. Venice, the mercantile thalassocracy, fought to protect its lucrative trade routes. Spain, the global superpower, sought to project its power in the Mediterranean and contain its main geopolitical rival. The giant they faced was the Ottoman Empire, personified in its naval commander Muezzinzadeh Ali Pasha. A brave commander favored by the Sultan, but tactically conservative, he led the most powerful and feared navy in the world. His fleet consisted of some 230 galleys, crewed by some of the most experienced sailors and the fearsome janissaries, the empire's elite infantry. The true strength of the Ottoman Empire lay not just in its ships or its men, but in its formidable, centralized state capacity. It could mobilize resources, build fleets, and launch campaigns on a scale and at a speed that a divided and constantly feuding Christian Europe could barely imagine. However, on that October day, a fatal flaw ran through the Ottoman system. It was not just Ali Pasha's error, but a cultural blind spot born of prolonged success. There was a widespread contempt for naval technological innovation, personified by their lack of response to the Venetian galleasses, which they considered slow and unwieldy. More profoundly, there was an ingrained belief that the sheer bravery and martial spirit of the janissaries in hand-to-hand combat could overcome any disadvantage in firepower. It was the arrogance of a superpower that had come, to believe its will and courage alone were sufficient to guarantee victory. The battlefield, the Gulf of Patras, became a crucial character, not for its complexity, but for its simplicity. Unlike other naval battles that depended on shifting winds or treacherous coastlines, the Gulf acted as a vast enclosed arena, an aquatic coliseum. This geographical confinement eliminated the possibility of complex maneuvers or strategic retreats, forcing a direct confrontation, a head-on collision of brute force. This simplicity masked the Holy League's main weakness, its absolute inability to agree on any strategy that required subtle coordination or mutual trust. The simple terrain forced a simple fight, and a simple fight was the only one they could win together. The fatal error, the decision that would condemn the victory to irrelevance, was not made during the heat of battle, but months earlier, in the negotiating halls where the Holy League was forged. The alliance was united with a single, short-sighted objective: to assemble a fleet, seek out and destroy the Ottoman navy in a single decisive battle. There was no long-term strategic plan. There was no agreement on what to do after the victory, how to exploit the success, what territories to reclaim, or how to manage power in a post-Ottoman Mediterranean. They assumed, with astonishing naivety, that winning the battle would mean winning the war. It was a monumental miscalculation that would turn their impending and glorious conquest into a bloody but strategically sterile spectacle. The battle began with the deployment of the Holy League's secret weapon. Positioned ahead of the main line, 6 enormous Venetian galleasses waited like floating fortresses. They were a monstrous hybrid, larger than a normal galley and equipped with devastating artillery on all flanks. As the Ottoman formation, perfectly aligned and confident, advanced, the galleasses opened fire. The result was carnage. Cannon broadsides tore through the tight Turkish formation, shattering oars, sweeping decks, and sinking galleys before they could even engage. It was a technological triumph that inflicted immense physical and moral damage, sowing chaos and confusion in the Ottoman lines. Traditional Ottoman naval tactics were based on speed, ramming, and superiority in hand-to-hand combat. Their goal was always to board the enemy ship and let the janissaries do the rest. But the galleasses neutralized this strategy before it could even begin. However, instead of using his numerical superiority and greater speed to outflank the Christian fleet and avoid the floating fortresses, the Ottoman commander, Ali Pasha, made a fatal mistake driven by pride. Ignoring the advice of his more experienced admirals, he directed his flagship, the Sultana, directly toward the real Don John of Austria's flagship, seeking a duel of honor to decide the battle. In doing so, Ali Pasha sealed the fate of his fleet. Instead of a naval battle of maneuvers, he transformed the engagement into hundreds of infantry battles fought on floating, blood-slicked decks. And on that ground, the Christians had a decisive advantage. The Spanish tercios. Considered the finest infantry in Europe, these professional soldiers equipped with arquebuses, pikes, and swords were killing machines in enclosed spaces. Ali Pasha's decision to seek a boarding action was like an expert fencer choosing to challenge a brawler to a fight in a phone booth. He was taking the battle to the very ground where his enemy was most lethal. The epicenter of the world-changing battle was reduced to a few square meters of splintered wood, the deck of the real Don John's flagship was rammed not only by Ali Pasha's Sultana, but by several other galleys. The janissaries in ferocious waves assaulted the Christian ship, and for a time it seemed they would be overwhelmed. Don John was wounded in the leg, and the crew fought desperately to hold on. The entire battle, the fate of the Mediterranean, hung in the balance, depending on which side could send reinforcements to this floating choke point first. At the most critical moment, as the Holy League's banner on the reel wavered, the Christian commanders demonstrated a coordination that had been lacking before. Alvaro de Bazan, commanding the reserve, and Marcantonio Colonna, commander of the center, sent their own galleys to reinforce Don John. Their ships crashed into the flanks of the Ottoman, galleys besieging the reel, relieving the pressure. The tide of the small battle within the larger battle began to turn. The Spanish arquebusiers, now supported, swept the Ottoman decks with deadly fire. The combat on the reel became a whirlwind of indescribable violence. For over an hour, men fought hand-to-hand with swords, axes, and knives. The decks were so covered in blood and bodies they were slippery. Finally, after several waves of assault and counter-assault, the Spanish tercios managed to board the Sultana. The fighting was brutal, but the outcome was decisive. The resistance of the janissaries aboard their own flagship was crushed. The climax came when Ali Pasha, fighting bravely amidst his men, was wounded by an arquebus shot. He fell, and a Spanish soldier, not knowing who he was, cut off his head. A captain, recognizing the face of the Ottoman admiral, took the head and impaled it on a pike, hoisting it on the prow of the Sultana for all to see. The sight of the dead admiral and the capture of the sacred standard of the Caliph, which flew on his ship, was the death blow to Ottoman morale. The news spread like wildfire through the Turkish fleet. The sight of their commander's head on a pike created a cascading panic. Organized resistance, which until that moment had been fierce in many sectors, simply collapsed. Discipline broke, and the Ottoman captains, without central leadership and facing certain defeat, tried to flee. The battle was instantly transformed into a brutal, one-sided hunt. The Christian galleys, now in full pursuit, chased down the Ottoman ships attempting to escape. Many were caught and boarded, their crews massacred or captured. Others, in desperation, ran themselves ashore, where their crews abandoned them and fled inland. Of the nearly 230 Ottoman galleys that had entered the Gulf that morning, fewer than 50 managed to escape. It was an almost total annihilation. The final collapse was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological disintegration. The fleet that had terrorized the Mediterranean for a century had been wiped off the map in the space of a few hours. Ottoman invincibility at sea, a carefully cultivated myth, had been shattered along with the masts of their ships. The victory of the Holy League was not just complete, it was absolute, a slaughter on a scale the world had not seen in generations. However, even in the moment of triumph, the seeds of strategic futility were already sprouting. As the Christians secured their prizes and counted their dead, they were already thinking not of the next step in the war, but of how to divide the spoils. The very unity that had given them victory in battle was about to dissolve at the prospect of capitalizing on it. The glory of the victory was so blinding that it prevented them from seeing the opportunity that lay before them. The Battle of Lepanto, the most violent and bloody struggle of the galley era, was over. The Holy League had achieved the impossible. They had destroyed the Ottoman navy, but the question that no one was asking amidst the euphoria was the most important one. What now? The answer to that question would reveal the true nature of their victory. A spectacular tactical triumph that masked a monumental strategic failure. The scale of the carnage at Lepanto was difficult to comprehend, even by the brutal standards of the 16th century. The statistics were a testament to the ferocity of the combat. On the Ottoman side, the losses were catastrophic. An estimated 30,000 men were killed or captured. Of their vast fleet, nearly 200 ships were sunk or captured, an unprecedented material blow. In contrast, the Holy League suffered around 7,500 dead, a terrible figure, but significantly lower. The victory was undeniable, absolute, and mathematically crushing. The sea was literally red with blood and covered with the wreckage of what had been the most powerful navy in the world. The fate of the defeated commander, Muezzinzadeh Ali Pasha, was a brutal reflection of his fleet's total defeat. After being wounded and falling on the deck of his flagship, he was beheaded by a Spanish soldier. His head was displayed on a pike, a savage gesture of triumph that served to annihilate the morale of his men. It was an ignominious end for the commander of the world's most feared navy, a potent symbol that the aura of Ottoman invincibility had been decapitated along with its admiral. His death marked the end of organized resistance and the beginning of the massacre. For the victors, the immediate aftermath was a mixture of euphoria, exhaustion, and the grim task of dealing with the consequences. Thousands of Christian slaves who rode in the Ottoman galleys were freed, an outcome celebrated throughout Europe as an act of divine liberation. However, the victorious alliance began to show cracks almost immediately. Disputes over the division of spoils, the fate of the captured ships, and most importantly, the next strategic move erupted between the Venetian and Spanish commanders. The unity that had given them victory in battle quickly evaporated in the salt air of triumph. This is where the true deconstruction of the Lepanto myth begins. While Europe erupted in celebrations, painting pictures and writing epic poems about the battle that saved Christendom, in Istanbul, the Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, a brilliant statesman, reacted not with panic, but with cold determination. He initiated a massive and unprecedented naval reconstruction program. Using the formidable bureaucratic machinery and vast resources of the Ottoman state, He achieved what seemed impossible. In less than 6 months, over a single winter, a new Ottoman fleet of more than 200 ships, many of a more modern design, was built and launched. The beard, as he had predicted, had grown back, stronger than before. Meanwhile, the victorious Holy League was falling apart. Internal disputes, mutual distrust, and divergent strategic goals paralyzed it. Don John of Austria wanted to take the war to the heart of the Ottoman Empire, but Venice and Spain could not agree on a plan. The League formally dissolved the following year, its great victory squandered in mutual recriminations. The final consequence was a devastating historical irony. In 1573, Venice, abandoned by its allies, was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire. Not only did it formally cede the island of Cyprus, the original cause of the war, but it also agreed to pay a huge war indemnity to the defeated Ottomans. The myth of Lepanto was forged precisely to conceal this shameful strategic reality. The battle was presented as the decisive military victory that curbed Ottoman power, a propaganda narrative that served the interests of Spain and the papacy. The reality is that Lepanto was, above all, a psychological triumph. It shattered the widespread belief in Ottoman invincibility at sea, a moral blow from which they never fully recovered. However, it did not break their actual naval power. The battle was immortalized in European art and literature, not just to celebrate the valor of its men, but to mask the fact that European leaders utterly failed to capitalize on their success, losing the peace after having decisively won the war. In the long run, Lepanto marked the beginning of a stalemate in the Mediterranean, not a shift in power. The Ottoman Empire turned its attention to its eastern borders with Persia, while Spain became increasingly embroiled in the conflicts of the Atlantic and Northern Europe. The battle did not save Europe, which was never truly in danger of being conquered by sea. What it did was create a powerful legend that served to bolster the identity of a Christian Europe at a time of deep internal divisions. The myth of Lepanto is more important for what it says about Europe's need to believe in its own unity and triumph than for the actual strategic impact the battle had. The most incisive and enduring truth about the Battle of Lepanto came not from a European chronicler or a court poet, but from the Ottoman Grand Vizier himself, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha. In a conversation with a Venetian diplomat after the battle, as the new Ottoman fleet was already being built in the shipyards of the Golden Horn, the vizier uttered an analogy that perfectly summarized the strategic situation with brutal clarity. He told the Venetian that the loss of the fleet for the vast and wealthy Ottoman Empire was like a rich man shaving his beard, a temporary inconvenience, but it would grow back, perhaps even stronger. In contrast, the vizier continued, the loss of Cyprus for the Republic of Venice, a state whose power was based entirely on its maritime possessions and routes, was like a man losing an arm. It was a permanent loss, a mutilation from which it could never fully recover. History, with its cold indifference to heroic myths, proved the Grand Vizier entirely correct. The victory at Lepanto was glorious, bloody, and unforgettable. But on the grand chessboard of geopolitics, it was the shrewd and cynical assessment of the defeated man that defined the true and lasting legacy of the battle.